before we get started with the presentation itself, maybe we could start with just a moment of prayer. So let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the gift of this day and for this ability to gather together. We ask you to help us to have an open heart and an open mind as we hear about the reality on the US-Mexico border. In particular, help to open our hearts to the many migrants, to their situation, to their stories, that we might see them as brothers and sisters in Christ, that we might see them as dignified human beings who deserve the ability to live and to thrive just as any other one of your children, Lord. We ask you to bless us this day, bless this gathering. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Father and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, I'm going to do a little screen share here. I've got a lot of visuals and a lot of stuff on my slides. So hopefully you guys, let's make sure the screen share works well. All right, thumbs up. We're seeing my shared screen here. Okay, great. I'm seeing thumbs up. So like I said, I was ordained a Catholic priest about a year ago and got missioned to the Diocese of Brownsville, Texas, where we are serving as Jesuits for the first time. We've never had a community down here, but we came under the invitation of the bishop, Bishop Daniel Flores, who's the bishop here at the Diocese of Brownsville. And that first month we were there, we were trying to get our bearings straight about what exactly we were going to be doing in terms of ministry and what his expectations were for us. And so we had a conversation with him where we got to ask him, what are the needs and what are you looking for? And I was very struck by the language that he used in that meeting, what he told us. And what he told us is that what I love about Jesuits and what I'm most interested in having you guys as Jesuits serving the diocese is read the reality and respond to it. And so that kind of became the, I think, guiding force for our project down here in the Diocese of Brownsville on the US-Mexico border. Let's read the reality, see what the reality is, and find the ways to respond to it. So that was it. That was an interesting task. He didn't just tell us, I want you to be pastors of a local parish. He gave us a more broad task, which I think fits well with our charism as Jesuits. So let's talk a little bit about the reality that we've seen since we've been down here. So we're located on the US-Mexico border, which is an extensive built border. It's over 2,000 miles long, stretching from San Diego, Tijuana on the Pacific coast down to Brownsville, Matamoros on the Gulf of Mexico. So we are at the easternmost point of the US-Mexico border. It's the US-Mexico border, 2,000 miles long. It's also the most crossed international border with over 350 million legal crossings that happen every year. So of all the borders around the world, that's the volume of crossings at the US-Mexico border is really remarkable. It's tremendous. There's about 50 ports of entry that would be like border checkpoint cross points that span the US and Mexico border that are located in about 35 different spots. So some bigger cities like El Paso and Juarez have multiple ports of entry in a single city area. The Rio Grande Valley is where we're located here on the eastern part of the border, also abbreviated to be known as the RGV. So it's the easternmost part of the border. So if you're a migrant or asylum seeker coming to the border, you're coming from the south up to the north, you're seeking asylum. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. You could present yourself at a port of entry and enter at port of entry, one of those 50 spots, or in other cases, and we'll talk about some of the causes of that, you might be entering in between ports, which is the language we use for someone who might cross through a desert or who would cross over the Rio Grande River or something like that. Would be crossing between ports. So I'll use some of that language as we go through the talk today. The twin cities located in the Rio Grande Valley include Matamoros, Brownsville, which is kind of the easternmost urban population, which both have around 500,000 people in it. And then about an hour further west from there is the McAllen, Reynosa area. And all of that is kind of grouped into the Rio Grande Valley. And the ministry we're doing extends through all that area. And so if you combine the population size of all 4 of those municipalities, it's about the equivalent of the El Paso, Ciudad Juarez population in the western part of Texas, which is Texas is a big state. So El Paso, Brownsville, same state, but they're about 14 hours away from each other driving in a car, just to give you some sense of geography here. The poverty rate in Brownsville is very acute. It's a city that's consistently ranking on the list of poorest cities in the US, with a lot of people living below the poverty line, low rates of high school diplomas in education, high rates of government assistance like food stamps, those kind of programs. We're serving in the Diocese of Brownsville, and it's a very large diocese. The Catholic population here, 85% of the population. There are very few cities in the US where you'd see the percentage of Catholics to population to be so high. And so there's over 1 million Catholics in the Diocese of Brownsville. And yet there's definitely a shortage. I mean, I think places all around the world are experiencing these clergy shortage, or even men and women religious shortages. And that's certainly acutely felt here. There's about 72 parish and missions staffed by less than 100 priests, which puts about one priest to 12,000 Catholics. A lot of the dioceses on the East Coast, for example, might have one priest to 500 or to 1,000 Catholics or something like that. So to see 1 to 12,000 shows you the lack of resources at a large Catholic population here kind of being underserved. So just kind of painting a picture a little bit, because we're trying to read the reality of what's down here. Here's a map just to kind of place things. You can see in the inset, the whole map of Texas. And so we're talking about just that southernmost part of it. Before I moved down here, I hadn't spent a whole lot of time in Texas. So if you would have asked me, I would have said Houston is in the southern part of Texas. Well, we're 5 hours drive further south than Houston to get down to the Rio Grande Valley. So it's really down here. And so Casa Miguel Pro is the name of the Jesuit community. It's where we live. San Felipe is a parish we help out at, and that's all in the Brownsville, Matamoros area. But we do a lot of ministry, and a lot of the migrant stories that I'm going to talk about take place more in the McAllen, Reynosa area. So I have pointed out the Humanitarian Respite Center, Casa del Migrante, and Senda Vida 1 and 2, which I'll go into a little bit more details. But just to kind of give you a little bit of picture about what the geography and the layout of the land is down here. So now let's talk about what's happening in terms of border policy. The US-Mexico border is effectively closed to asylum seekers, and that's been the case since March of 2020 when COVID started. Then President Trump invoked a public health ordinance called Title 42, which basically said, hey, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and so for the safe and interest of our country, we're not going to allow anyone to present themselves at one of our 50 port of entries and say, hey, I'm fleeing persecution in my home country and I'd like to seek asylum in the United States of America. And so we said, because of the global pandemic, we're not going to let anyone do that, even though generally speaking, international law requires that of us in any country. And so instead we said it's too much of a health risk. We're not going to allow people into the country. Well, that has continued to be in effect even to today. So there was an announcement by the CDC back in April that they were going to revoke Title 42 and stop applying it in May of this year. But a couple of states sued the federal government saying that it wasn't following proper procedures in revoking this ordinance. And the courts have delayed the removal of Title 42. So it continues to remain the ruling force on the US-Mexico border. You might also be familiar or have heard the phrase remain in Mexico, also known as the Migrant Protection Protocols or MPPs. That was a policy that was started during the Trump presidency, where if someone came to the United States and wanted to seek asylum and got enrolled in the asylum process, they could make a case to asylum court. But the thing was, they had to remain in northern Mexico for the duration of their court dates and things like that, which can take 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 months. And so a lot of vulnerable people, especially coming from Central America, were enrolled in the asylum process, but instead of being allowed to reunite with family or sponsors in the US, perhaps look for work and earn back some money that they had invested in their journey, and said they were remaining in Mexico. That was very recently revoked. The new presidential administration had kind of rolled it back, and then it went to the courts, and then the Supreme Court ruled on it in June and allowed the administration to revoke it, and it was revoked last month in August. But just to speak briefly about asylum and what it is, I'm sure we're all coming from different levels. There might be immigration attorneys on this call, and there might be others who aren't as familiar with immigration policies. So just to speak very briefly about what asylum is. Asylum is the right of someone to look for safety and security in somewhere when they're fleeing persecution. And so international law categorizes the persecutions around 5 different areas, things like your political views or your belonging to a particular identity group that puts you at the risk of persecution, among others. So there's five categories that fit specifically into asylum law. And how it would normally work for most of the recent history of the United States is an asylum seeker, basically someone who's fleeing persecution and in fearing for their personal safety in their home country, would show up at a port of entry, one of the 50 port of entries on the US-Mexico border, would encounter a border guard there and say, I'm fleeing persecution in my home country of El Salvador. I have a fear of returning there, and I'd like to seek asylum in the United States of America. Well, that would trigger a process. They'd be taken aside and given what's called a credible fear interview, basically where someone is just assessing, do they have a credible fear of returning to their home country? This isn't a ruling on their asylum case. It's just, are they giving some signs that they have some fear of being sent back to their home country? Like, would it be dangerous for us to put them on a plane and return them to their home country? And so if a case is approved for credible fear, they're enrolled in the asylum process, they're released into the country with documentation, and they've got a court date that they've got to follow to apply for asylum. That's basically how asylum law works. Right now, because of Title 42, people aren't able to show up at a port and say, I'm here to ask for asylum. And so the ports of entry are closed to asylum seekers. So what are their options? Their options are to try to cross between ports, to cross over a river, to cross through the desert. And many of them, what they're doing, they're not trying to enter the country undocumented. They'll cross over the border, they'll sit at the nearest road, and they'll wave to the helicopters in the sky to try to get Border Patrol's attention, or a truck driving by. They'll say, now that I'm in your country, I'd like to claim asylum. You know, you didn't allow me to come in through the port, so I found another way, but here I am. I'd like to seek asylum in your country. I have a fear of returning to my country. Well, with Title 42, a lot of those cases are now being left to the subjective discretion of the Border Patrol agent. So they could take those people and expel them to their home country or back to Mexico under Title 42. In other cases, they might decide that the person seems very particularly vulnerable, and they might decide to enroll them in the asylum process. Another way that people are able to enter the country to make an asylum claim right now is by petitioning for an exemption to Title 42. So this is for people with vulnerable cases. It might be a woman who is 7 months pregnant and is living in a shelter, a migrant shelter in northern Mexico, where they don't have any access to prenatal care. That would be a very vulnerable case. Another vulnerable case could be someone who's suffering from a terminal illness, or someone who's been kidnapped and been robbed in their transit in Mexico. These are cases that are extremely vulnerable. And so they can get granted an exception to Title 42 and be permitted to enter the United States, and then after being admitted could enter an asylum process. If you can tell, this is a very confusing system. It used to be pretty simple. Show up at the port, say you have a fear of returning to your home country, enter the process. Nowadays, you're making decisions. Do I try to cross between a port over a dangerous river? Do I enter into this desert with my family and maybe my children? Or I'm a pregnant woman. Do I risk this journey just to be able to get on American soil to make an asylum claim? Or do I wait in a shelter in northern Mexico and try to find some human rights lawyer or defender who can submit my case to immigration to see if I could be worthy of an exemption to allow me to get into the country? That's the reality of what our asylum law looks like right now. So what are the results of that? Well, as you can probably imagine, the results are there are thousands of people stuck in northern Mexico because they can't just show up at a port of entry and ask for asylum. So what we're seeing, trying to read the reality, is thousands of people in particular stuck in Reynosa, Mexico, across the border from McAllen. So I have some pictures here of just a few of the shelters where people are being housed. Senda de Vida on the left side of the screen is probably the longest, most established shelter run by an evangelical pastor, Pastor Hector, who's been doing this work for migrants for over 30 years. And he runs this shelter that has a capacity of between 1,000 and 1,500 people, as he's seen the capacity grow and expand, trying to expand his walls of his shelter to accommodate more people because of the quantity of migrants who are trapped essentially in northern Mexico, wanting to seek asylum in the US and not being able to enter in a process to do that. The picture on the top on that left side is some families and groups who are Russian and Ukrainian, the only Russians and Ukrainians that we've met so far along the border. Most of the migrants we meet are from Central America, and then others are from South America or from Haiti, and I'll talk more about those demographics. But there was a group of about a dozen people who came together from the Ukraine and Russia and were at Senda de Vida. The picture on the right of Senda Dos, or Senda 2, was a new shelter that was just built in May. Basically took a giant baseball field and built a huge cinder block wall around it in a rectangle, essentially, just to provide a space for all these thousands of migrants, to give them somewhere to be safe. Northern Mexico, I can remind you, not the safest place to travel. The US doesn't even recommend that US citizens travel to northern Mexico because of the work of the cartels there. The danger levels are so high. They categorize it as the same safety risk as traveling to Iraq or Afghanistan. And yet that's where we're leaving all these migrants, including women and children and family units who are trapped basically in northern Mexico in this very dangerous area. So Senda 2 was basically constructed as a way to provide a walled safety for people to live. But as you can see, that means a lot of people are living in tents on a gravel ground in South Texas or northern Mexico, where the temperatures, on a day like today, reach 100 degrees. So not a very comfortable place to live. A lot of people seek shelter during the day under that big canvas tent that you can see on the bottom of the screen. But that has a capacity of about 1,000 to 1,500 people as well. And you can see how crowded it can get in the picture on the right. So those are a couple of the principal shelters that are here. Another one is Casa del Migrante, which is run by the Catholic Diocese of Matamoros. It has a smaller capacity of about 200 people or so, and it prioritizes in particular women and children. And then there's a lot of people who are left on the streets. I mean, the shelter capacity can only reach so many people. And so a lot of people have set up tents or lean-tos against the walls of shelters and are living right outside shelters or in the neighboring areas. There's a new camp that has about 400, 500 people. That's tents that are put on the Rio Grande River on the Mexican side. And they have very limited access to water and sanitation and food and things like that. So here we are reading the reality. I mean, we're down here, we're just overwhelmed by the amount of people that we're encountering who are in northern Mexico. And so we're thinking, okay, this is the reality. I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis. I mean, these are people who are living in a very vulnerable place and who don't have access to a lot of resources. So we're wondering to ourselves, what is the response? Like, what is happening on the ground here? So what is happening? Oh, I guess the one other thing I should share, on the northern side of the border, on the US side of the border, there's also the Humanitarian Respite Center run by Catholic Charities, which receives migrants who have been permitted to enter the country either through an exemption to Title 42 or have been enrolled in the asylum process. And it's a shelter that they'll go to and arrange transportation to unite with families around the country. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And also the other part of the reality is the shifting demographics. We've seen in the past 4 or 5 months an increase in the amount of Haitians that are coming to the northern border of Mexico. Most of the Haitians that we encounter are coming from Chile and Brazil. They fled Haiti because of some of the violence in that country and natural disasters, the big earthquake that happened in Port-au-Prince about 10 years ago. And so they got temporary visas, humanitarian visas, to go to Chile or to go to Brazil. And they've been living there until those visas are expiring. And now because they're expiring, they're seeking asylum somewhere, and they've had a hard time in their life in Chile and Brazil. And so many have made the decision to journey overland thousands of miles to get to the US-Mexico border. But because of the border being effectively closed under Title 42, many of them are stranded in the shelters in northern Mexico. And Haitian families in particular face a lot of added vulnerabilities to other Central American or South American migrants, because most of them speak Haitian Creole and French as their primary languages, whereas the language of the border, and certainly in Mexico, is Spanish. And other migrants who are coming from Central and South America are fluent in Spanish, native Spanish speakers, and so that's a little bit easier. And then for racial discrimination, Haitian migrants, for the color of their skin, are targeted more often and face racial discrimination too. So a lot of issues that we're seeing with that. So that, again, painting the picture a little bit of some of that reality of what's going on there and some of those shifting demographics. So that's the reality. So then what is the response? The bishop invited us to read the reality and respond to it. So keeping in mind some of these realities, what are the organizations, what are the responses, and how too can we as Jesuits respond? I think we were surprised to see the lack of a response from the government. I mean, let's be clear, it's US and Mexican policies that are governing the border between these two countries. And so what are those governments doing to provide for this humanitarian situation on the border, with so many people caught in northern Mexico without access to the facilities that they need and living in a very dangerous area? But there's no humanitarian support. None of the shelters that I spoke of are receiving funding from government sources to provide food or shelter or water or sanitation. It's not coming from any government, either the US or Mexican government. And as I'm sure many of you have seen in the news, the response of some of the local governments is very antagonistic to migrants. Governor Abbott, the governor here in Texas, has been making headline news for busing migrants from the border, not from the Rio Grande Valley, but from Laredo and Eagle Pass, a couple other points on the Texas border with Mexico, putting them on buses and sending them out to cities on the East Coast, like many of you, maybe where you live in New York or in Boston, in Chicago, in other parts of the country. And the governors of Arizona and Florida have started doing the same. I know recently some were put on planes with promises of work in Boston and land on Martha's Vineyard, trying to figure out what the heck they're going to do there. And so just to speak about the Texas situation, as of just last week or 10 days ago or whatnot, they'd spent over $14 million busing over 8,000 migrants around the country at a cost of almost $1,800 per migrant. So that's the investment they're making in the migrant situation. I mean, I tell you what, the shelters in northern Mexico could do a lot with $14 million in terms of providing food and adequate water and sanitation to migrants who are in severe need. But there's a misdirection of resources, I would say, in terms of helping people in their most vulnerable need. What about the media? How is the media responding to this? When I look at the media talking about the border, some of the phrases I see often are border crisis. I might put it more as a humanitarian crisis happening at our border. I mean, our border is in good shape. There are great people living on both sides of the border, people of great goodwill that are doing, I think, really good things. There's a humanitarian crisis that's a result of government policy, but otherwise I wouldn't maybe describe the border itself as a place of crisis per se. If it is, it's because of policies that our countries have put into effect. We use phrase like illegal migrants or people have entered the country illegally. Like, for example, people who are legally enrolled in the asylum process, who are then put on buses and shipped around the country. News articles are calling them illegal. Well, they're in a legal process to seek asylum in our country. They did cross our border between ports, which is breaking US law, but they did so because they weren't permitted to present themselves at a port of entry. And once they were apprehended by Border Patrol, they are now legally in the country once they're enrolled in the asylum process. So that's language that's maybe not helpful. We also talk about migration. The media talks about record numbers of apprehensions at the US-Mexico border. Well, part of that is a cause of Title 42 because people are being rounded up and then expelled immediately into Mexico. So then they cross the next day, they get rounded up, sent back into Mexico. So you get a lot of repeat crossings of people who get counted multiple times that make the numbers falsely inflated. And so even the media isn't necessarily kind of capturing the reality right in a lot of instances that I see. They do tend to focus on tragedies. That's maybe the stories that get highlighted the most. Maybe you recall last year around this time, around September in Del Rio, Texas, Border Patrol was responding to a large number of Haitians that were crossing the border because they had received some false information that they could cross legally over the river. And there was a case of Border Patrol on horseback chasing down these migrants. Or more recently, over the summer, a bus in San Antonio that was found with migrants in it, a trailer, I should say, that had over 50 migrants who had died in the heat while being trapped in the trailer. So some focus on those tragedies, which helps shed light in some ways on the difficult situations that migrants are living in, but maybe doesn't paint the full picture of what's going on at the border and what the more recurring needs are when we're talking about what's going on down here. So if the government isn't responding well, if media isn't even capturing the story right, who is responding to the migrant situation on our border? Well, what we find is that most of that response is from nonprofits and NGOs. I give a big list of them, from Catholic Charities in the Rio Grande Valley, Good Neighbor Settlement House Team Brownsville, then also talk about Reynosa Matamoros, Senda de Vida 1 and 2 that I've talked about, Casa del Migrante, and a whole list of other ones, including some that focus on education, like Save the Children and the Sidewalk Schools, others that focus on health, like Doctors Without Borders and Global Response Management, and others that work in various areas like Angry Tias and Abuelas. So a lot of organizations are what's pulling the weight. It's nonprofits that are running these shelters. It's nonprofits that are making donations of food and clothing. Solidarity Engineering is an organization that's working on water and sanitation in a lot of these migrant shelters. And all of these are receiving private funding from goodwill, individuals of goodwill that are providing for what they can. And so the response becomes very local and very small scale because, private donations aren't going to reach the scale of the government of Texas that can spend $14 million on essentially a migrant publicity stunt, shipping people around the country. None of the sum total of the nonprofits on your page, on the page that I'm showing on the slide, don't have $14 million to spend in a year total, much less in 1 month. And so there's definitely a mismatch of resources. And so there's a lack of ability to respond. And so we're trying to enter into that by making our own response. And we like to think of our response as Catholic priests, as Jesuits, as being one rooted in our Catholic identity, responding to that call of Matthew 25, right? For I was a stranger and you welcomed me. You know, whenever you did these things for the least of these, you did them for me. That's the invitation from Jesus. And that's what guides us in our life and ministry down here. As a Society of Jesus, if you're familiar with this language, we released a couple years ago our universal apostolic preferences that are to guide us in our life and ministry. And so there's 4 preferences. And one of them I think speaks very directly to our work in ministry down here on the border. And that is walking with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated, and to do so in the mission of reconciliation and justice. We certainly meet and encounter a lot of people who are treated as outcasts of the world, who don't feel safe in their own home country, and who have come seeking a better life, seeking opportunities, seeking safety and shelter for themselves and their families, and are being basically told no at the door, not unlike Joseph and Mary as they were looking for shelter as Jesus was born. So now let me paint a little picture for you about what ministry we're actively doing down here in the Rio Grande Valley. So part of our ministry is in local parishes. As I talked about, it's a very underserved diocese, right? There's a lot of Catholics down here and not a lot of priests and men and women religious who are able to serve in communities. And so we help out at a pair of parishes, and we've recently combined to serve at one parish together. So that's part of our ministry, which includes everything from daily masses to Sunday ministry to baptisms to quinceañeras. There's a lot of quinceañeras here in the Rio Grande Valley, so we find ourselves doing a lot of those for teenage girls. Along with parish ministry, we work with unaccompanied migrants, unaccompanied minors who are held in detention centers. So if you come to the US-Mexico border and you're under the age of 18 and you're not traveling with a parent, what the US government will do is they won't deport you or send you somewhere else because you're a minor. They'll take you into a local detention center while they verify that you have someone to receive you here in the United States who is either a parent or immediate or family member, or someone that your parents approve of you getting released to. So my minors, unaccompanied minors like this, who could be as young as 5, 6, 7 years old. Maybe they came up with an older sibling, who's also a minor, or maybe they came up with an aunt or an uncle who's not their parent. And so to prevent there being any human trafficking, that's why the US government takes any accompanied migrant, puts them in a detention center and verifies who they're being released to in the country. So a lot of them are teenagers between 14 and 17 years old, but we do have sometimes very young unaccompanied migrants who are 6, 7, 8 years old, 9, 10, 11, 12, who have come up to the country. They're staying in these detention centers, sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes for 2 or 3 months, as the US government is verifying who they're being released to in the country. So our parish, San Felipe de Jesus, that we help out at, does a lot of ministry for unaccompanied migrant kids, inviting them to come to the parish through the approval of the detention centers and join us for Mass on Sundays, or come on Wednesday for a program where we do a little bit of a reflection on scripture and do a little song and dance routine. And whenever they come and visit, we always share with them a meal. So both some time for prayer and sacraments, but then also some time for relaxation and some food. And I'm often very moved at our encounters with the unaccompanied migrant youth. You can see a lot of girls there kneeling before the tabernacle in prayer. Off to the side, we also have an altar to Mary. And a lot of times the migrants' kids will ask if they can go and pray before Mary. And you'll see them just kneeling down before Mary, oftentimes with tears falling down in their eyes as they're just praying for Mary's help and support in their life and journey. And they bring a lot and carry a lot with them. We hear a lot of confessions also for the unaccompanied youth. And a lot of times it'll start maybe with a listing of some sins that they're asking God's forgiveness for, but it often evolves into a conversation about how much they miss their family and maybe regrets that they feel of not saying goodbye to their grandmother before they left on their journey, and carrying that with them, and the kind of pain they feel of that, or thinking about times that they disrespected their parents and now how much they miss them and how bad they feel because of that. And so in those moments, we just try to communicate God's love and mercy and to assure them that their parents, know that they love them too, and send their love that way. So that's some of our ministry with migrant youth. We also do ministry in the shelters in northern Mexico and Reynosa. So today's a Tuesday. Tuesdays and Thursdays are our days. So I'm recently returned from northern Mexico this morning. Father Louis and I went over to Reynosa, and we went to Casa del Migrante first, where we celebrated Mass for about 200 migrants, mostly pregnant women and other women with children, which is what Casa del Migrante prioritizes. And so we celebrate Mass there with them. And after we celebrate Mass, we go over to Senda de Vida Dos, or two, the second really large migrant shelter that's got over 1,000 people living in it. And we bring donations of hygiene products and cleaning supplies, like the picture on the right there shows, whether that's sponges and mops or bleach or baby wipes or soap and shampoo. Those are some of the items that we bring over and bring to the migrant shelter. And you can see, I mean, when you're having to cook meals to serve food for 1,000 to 1,500 people, sometimes it means mixing your rice or pasta in giant coolers that you might usually see at a tailgate filled with ice cold beverages. And so that's one of the coolers that we brought over there that they use for food preparation, just because of the quantities of food that they have to prepare. So we were there midday today, bringing some hygiene products and cleaning supplies and kitchen items for Senda de Vida too. And then in the afternoons, we go over to the Humanitarian Respite Center, which is on the US side of the border, as I mentioned. And we also celebrate Mass there with the migrants who have entered the country and are legally in the country and are arranging transportation to go anywhere in the country where they might be reunited with family members or their local sponsors, and to pursue their asylum claims and perhaps to look for work there and that sort of thing. So you can notice sometimes the difference in the mood between celebrating Mass at Casa del Migrante, where people are stuck in northern Mexico and have been told that they can't enter the country unless they get an exemption for their vulnerabilities, and that it could take weeks or months for that to be recognized. So that's a pretty desperate situation. And then to celebrate Mass in the Humanitarian Respite Center in the US, where people are starting to feel a sense of relief of being permitted to enter the country and wanting to give thanks to God for that, but also a sense of being overwhelmed and disoriented because, wow, you're realizing just how big this task is going to be, entering into a new country and trying to start a life there, and maybe even thinking about just some of the legal steps that you're going to have to follow because you've just been released from Border Patrol that's giving you all this documents that even with multiple master's degrees, I have a hard time combing my way through. So you can imagine how overwhelming that can feel sometimes for migrants. But sometimes we have the fortunate experience of running into migrants in the US at the Humanitarian Respite Center that we've met and got to know in northern Mexico. So the picture on the right is in front of this beautiful image of Guadalupe that's in the Humanitarian Respite Center, with a bunch of migrants that we had known and spent months and were part of this Catholic community that we had formed in the plaza in northern Mexico. And so we ran into them there and were able to celebrate Mass with them at the HRC before they departed and reunited with family and friends in other parts of the country. And so that always is a source of great joy for us. But at this point, I feel like I've been giving a lot of data, a lot of facts, trying to paint the picture as clear as I can. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes before I'll open it up to questions for, so spend a few minutes here sharing some stories of migrants, just to kind of paint the picture a little bit clearer and fuller. So maybe I could start by sharing the story of Claudia, who's someone who is very close to my own heart. She's the one taking the selfie on the left side of your screen. And she was a big fan of taking selfies. So we have a lot of selfies with Claudia. She's from Honduras. She worked in event planning when she was in Honduras, but her teenage son was targeted by a local gang in their town and pressured to join the gang, and he refused to do it. And so he was taken by gang members, accosted on the street and beaten to the point where they had to take him to the hospital. They were very concerned because he kept getting texts of threats that the gang was going to kill him. And so him and his mom moved him from the local hospital to a hospital about 100 miles away, hoping to try to flee the situation of violence. And they spent a couple of days there trying to figure out what they were going to do as these text messages of threats continued to come in. And so they decided to make the decision that this just didn't seem like a safe place for them to go. So without even returning to their home, they set off to try to come to the United States. Claudia has some family members, a brother and a sister, who are living in the United States. And so she thought, I think the situation is just not safe. It's not safe for my son. And if it's not safe for him, it's not safe for me. And so why don't we see if we can seek asylum in the United States? So they came up to Mexico and to the northern Mexico. and found that it wasn't, the US border was effectively closed because of Title 42. And so they set up shop in the plaza in northern Mexico. None of the shelters had space or capacity. So about 2,000 migrants got tents and set them up in this plaza right where the bridge between the US and Mexico is located, and just started living in this plaza. And they had wood fire stoves. And so different people, different migrants took up leadership roles. Local evangelical pastors were bringing donations of food. Other Mexican citizens or people coming across from the United States and organizations were trying to provide some basic supplies. We ourselves were making a lot of visits to this plaza while migrants were living there for about a year. And so we got to know Claudia. Claudia was one of the leaders of one of the kitchens. There were basically 4 kitchens located on the corner of the plazas, and she took a leadership role. She had this experience of event planning. She was very good at managing people. And so she was in charge of one of the kitchens, the yellow tent, Carpa Amarilla was what her kitchen was called, the one that she was working at. And she was a great leader of that camp. People looked to her for help. She was most famous around the camp, especially with kids, but also with adults, of always walking around. And if she felt like someone wasn't paying enough attention to her, she'd yell at them, "Valórame, valórame," which means value me, show me some respect and dignity. And so when we would walk in, if we'd go to another kitchen first, or if we'd go to start mass somewhere in some corner first, without stopping to greet Claudia first, inevitably we'd hear her voice echoing from underneath her tent where she's, or the tarp where she might be cooking. She'd say, "Padres, valórame, valórame." Don't just pass me by. You got to come say hi. And so we'd stop and say hi to Claudia. But it got to the point that some of the kids in the plaza thought her name was Valórame instead of Claudia. She was so well known for calling out to that. And so Claudia, a great leader there in the camp, a lover of selfies. After a couple of weeks of getting to know her, she insisted on preparing food for us for lunch every time we come. So we'd come, we'd drop off some donations, we'd celebrate mass with the Catholic community that was there, and then we'd pass by her tent, her tarp, her kitchen to eat a meal. And in the 6 or 7 months or so of her preparing meals for us, we never ate the same meal twice. So going every Tuesday and Thursday. And she only had a very limited list of ingredients that she could make for us, but she always thought of creative ways to adapt it, and prepared a lot of local cuisine from Honduras, where she's from, but also other Central American cuisine. And so we had quite a variety during our time getting to know her. Well, thanks be to God, she was able to earn an exemption from Title 42 and entered the country back in March, and got to go to St. Louis, Missouri, where her siblings are living. And she's in the process waiting for asylum claim. And it was with tremendous joy that in June, Father Louis and I went to St. Louis for our province ordinations. And that lower picture is us reuniting with Claudia, who came to our Jesuit ordinations in St. Louis. And so that was just a tremendous moment for us to be able to share, to connect with her on the other side of the border. She then invited us after the mass over to her house. And so we had a barbecue with her family there in St. Louis, which was a real treat for us. Another story that I'd like to share is the story of Gabby and Mady. They're a couple of migrants who are from El Salvador. They're a lesbian couple, and so because of their sexual orientation, they suffered from persecution and prejudice in their home country, and made the difficult decision to leave and migrate, seeking a safer life. They're both graphic designers by trade, so they're not a situation of economic migrants who are just like looking to get a job somewhere. They left very good and accomplished jobs, but were suffering from prejudice and persecution from their family members and their local community. And they thought, let's try to seek a better life somewhere else. I got to know them one of the first visits that I made to Senda 2, this brand new shelter that was opened around this baseball field, just a big cinder block, where all these people are living in tents under the hot sun on gravel ground. Because the two of them, with their experience with graphic design and work with spreadsheets, they were put in charge of the bodega there. Most of the migrants at Senda 2 or most of the people staffing Senda 2 are the local migrants who live there, because there's not money or funding to pay for full-time employees. So the migrants there staff the kitchens, they clean the bathrooms, they organize the guard to let people in and out of the facilities, and the bodega, which is the place where hygiene products are dispensed. Things like toilet paper, things like toothbrushes and toothpaste or soap or shampoo, sanitary pads for women, diapers for children are housed at that bodega. And so we bring donations of all of those products over. And so I brought them one day one of our first visits, and I got to meet Gabby and May, and they were staffing that. And I was just so impressed with the job that they were doing. They weren't professionally trained for this in particular. They weren't being paid for the work that they were doing, but they had a spreadsheet on the laptop that they had brought with them, that they had built, that had a full inventory of all the products that were coming in, all the products going out, and they had ledgers for all of that, and we're keeping track of all the donations. So I was super impressed with the job that they were doing. We exchanged phone numbers and stayed in touch, as I would ask them a day before our visit, what are your more acute needs? What is something that we can get you? The very first day I came, they said the highest priority is we need a fan, because this bodega is this concrete room and it has no ventilation. So the first donation I brought to them was just a giant industrial size fan to put on the floor of that bodega to help give them some cool air, cool them down a little bit in that bodega. But the other thing that I did was, as soon as I had heard about their situation, I reached out to a lawyer that afternoon who works with LGBT migrants in particular to try to ask for exemptions for Title 42 to allow them to get paroled into the country. And so within about 10 days, the lawyer was able to get approval from Border Patrol for the two of them to enter into the US as an exemption from Title 42. So the last day I saw them, May, who's pictured in the center of the picture of the five of us, wore a special shirt to greet me with. And it's a t-shirt that says, Nadie es ilegal, no one is illegal. It's got a picture of some migrants on it. Well, that's a t-shirt they got from the months that they spent in Chiapas in southern Mexico while they were waiting for some migrant paperwork to get worked through, and received help and aid from Mexican Jesuits who were working in Chiapas in the south of Mexico. And so they had a t-shirt of Jesuit assistance provided to them in the south of Mexico. And so she wanted to share it with me, a Jesuit working in the north of Mexico, providing some aid and help to them. And so they got into the country. We took that picture. I was really pleased to meet them and get to see this, see that they had been helped by Jesuits at the southern Mexico border. They went to Pennsylvania, where they met up with their sponsors and have been working to try to establish their life there. Well, 2 months after meeting them, I had the privilege of going to visit the Jesuit project in Chiapas in southern Mexico. And so when I was there, I got to meet some of the Jesuits involved and some of the other staff there, and I saw people wearing this same t-shirt. So of course I got myself one, and I started texting Gabby and May, telling them, oh, look, I found the t-shirts. I'm here with the Jesuits where you passed through in Chiapas. And Gabby said, well, Father, I hate to impose, but May's got her shirt and I don't have mine. So of course I took an extra shirt with me, got their mailing address, and sent them the t-shirt in the mail. And so that's a picture on the right of them receiving. Gabby's got her t-shirt on, and we sent them some stickers as well that say, Todos somos migrantes, we're all migrants. We're also nadie es ilegal, no one's illegal. And so it was with great joy that they received that package. And it's just been great to stay in touch with people as they come across the border. So just sharing a little bit about the migrant situation. I mean, Claudia, she had to live in a tent in the plaza of Reynosa, Mexico for almost 8 months. And her son was fleeing threats against his life in Honduras. They're in the US now and trying to establish their life, but certainly face a lot of difficulties and challenges. Their temporary permission to enter the country will expire in March. They're seeking asylum and safety so that they don't get deported back to Honduras, where her son, has received all these threats and was beaten to the point of being hospitalized. Gabby and Mady, they're in the US. We've got this great connection. They've been helped by Jesuits along the journey, but they faced a lot of persecution and prejudice back in their home country. They were delayed in Chiapas for 3 months in their migrant journey, trying to arrange some paperwork because they wanted to do it the right way. They wanted to enter legally, and they had to spend several weeks living under the hot sun in northern Mexico. The kind of experiences in a journey that really can shape and inform you for the rest of your life. But it's also a good reminder to all of us, I think, that migration is not a border issue, right? Migration is not a border issue. All the communities that we live in have migrants living in them. This map here is a map of many of the places where migrants that we've known in just our year working here on the border have settled. And so you might see the city that you live in or a city nearby located on this map. That's just a small slice of a handful of the people that we know and have stayed in touch with, where some of them have ended up. And so, in your local community, there are migrants living not far from you. And I'm sure many of you are aware of it. And maybe that's part of what interests you in being in this call, because you've dedicated a lot of time and effort to migrant ministry yourself in your local area. And so I applaud you for those efforts and encourage that. So before I open it up for questions here, I just want to give you a couple of concrete things that I'd encourage you to do if you've been inspired by what you've heard today, if you feel passionate about migration and are looking for ways to get involved. So one way you could get involved is by having an experience on the border, or joining in a border immersion experience, or even leading one with your local school or parish or young adult community. As the gospel says, as Jesus said to the apostles, come and you will see. I think it could be a very eye-opening experience. You can't have the same sense and thought of the border reality or of migration in general once you spent some time on the border, once you've gotten to know migrants themselves and heard some of their stories firsthand. I try to do as best I can sharing part of the story of a few migrants, but it's so much more impactful when you have a personal encounter. So come and see. Of course, you can also volunteer locally. Immigration is not just a border issue. Every community in the US has migrants. So look for local organizations like Catholic Charities, for example, or others. Certainly right now in some big cities around the country like Chicago and New York and DC, migrants have been bused there, and there's a need for a lot of volunteers to help and get involved in that. So please be part of the response. Provide human dignity, acknowledge the dignity of migrants by getting involved in your local community. A couple other things: you can support organizations and migrants directly by supporting organizations. The Jesuit, our project down here, we have an Amazon wish list. We also have a way you can donate through our province to fund all the products that we're sending down to dropping off at Send It To, the migrant shelter. So we can provide some links for how you can get to that. Catholic Charities in the Rio Grande Valley, run by Sister Norma Pimentel, does a lot of great work too. Another organization that you can support. Of course, advocating for change. Immigration reform falls very low on any politician's radar for a very important reason, because migrants don't vote. And so if you're in a political party and if you're trying to win elections, you might even talk a good game about immigration, but it's probably going to fall very low down on your priority list at the end of the day when you're trying to fight for legislation, because at the end of the day, affecting immigration change won't necessarily win you a lot of votes because migrants can't vote. And so help be a voice for the voiceless by making immigration reform a priority in the way that you vote and in the way that you petition your politicians. In particular, we want to see an end to Title 42. There are some members of Congress who are trying to include Title 42 in legislation that would make it permanent. It's meant to be a pandemic policy, and we want to try to revoke it. So let's make sure that it doesn't become some permanent border policy, because it's not an effective way to govern our border. It's not a good responsiveness to the humanitarian needs of migrants. And last but not least, a little personal plug: you can listen and share to the Jesuit Border podcast. Father Louis and I, who are the two Jesuits in migrant ministry down here in the Rio Grande Valley, started a podcast about a year ago where we share stories of our ministry and we interview people who are working down here. Season 1 and 2, you can already find wherever you get podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple Music or any other platforms. We're on just about all of them. And so look up the Jesuit Border podcast. Season 1, we based around Catholic social teaching. Season 2, we based around the corporal works of mercy. And season 3 is coming soon. We're going to launch in mid-October. Right before I started this call, we were interviewing a Holy Cross priest who spent a summer working down here while he's studying law. He's in law school. And so had a great interview with him. So we've got that one and many more coming to you soon. So like and share the Jesuit Border podcast. So I'm going to take a deep breath there. I've been kind of going nonstop for almost an hour here now, but we do have some time for questions and comments. We've kind of said this will be about an hour, so we'll go at least till 8. And then if anybody wants to leave at that point, you're welcome to. But if there are others who want to stay on to continue the conversation or deal with some more questions, I'm happy to take those. So maybe now I'll just kind of open up the floor. You also have my email address there. Feel free to email me if you want to get an access to our wish list or our newsletter, where I can send you a subscription for that, or any more information. So feel free to take that down. But now I'll go ahead and open it up for anyone who has questions or comments.
Well, maybe I'll get us started. Thank you so much, Brian. I learned so much from listening to all of that. And I've heard all these words, but I didn't honestly understand them all. So it was so educational. And then to see the stories, the faces, is so beautiful in what you're doing there. So thank you for your ministry and for sharing it with us. It was wonderful.
Yeah, of course. It's been kind of a crash course in immigration policy and things like that. Just being down here, I didn't come here with a degree in it, but every day you learn something new, you know. And it's amazing how policies, especially that are enacted in capital cities that are far away, are having a tremendous impact on the lives of people, men, women, and children who are living here on the border. And so we see the direct effects of that on a daily basis. So we've got some questions in the chat, so maybe I can start to field a couple of those. Katie's asking whether I was fluent in Spanish before going to Brownsville, and if not, how long did it take to learn? During my Jesuit formation, I spent 2.5 years living in Nicaragua. We have a stage of formation that's called Regency, where we work in full-time ministry for 2 or 3 years. A lot of Jesuits work at a high school or university in campus ministry or something like that during that time. But I done a degree in international development at Fordham. Just give a little shout out to IPED. I see Jerica's on the call. She's a fellow IPED alum with me. So it's a degree in international political economy and development. So after doing that degree, my Jesuit superiors missioned me to Nicaragua to work in a nonprofit there. And when I was discerning that with my provincial, I kept telling him over and over again, I was like, well, the only thing I'm concerned about is that I don't speak Spanish. And I think that's going to be important in Nicaragua. And he just kept telling me, yeah, I'm not worried about that. It's like, well, I am. And so it was a long process of learning Spanish, language learning. I was in my 30s already when I was sent to Nicaragua. And so it can be a bit of a process as an adult. So I would say it took me a good year before I felt comfortable in it, and maybe even longer to get any good at it. But it served me very well, because then 3 years after I left Nicaragua, I was ordained a priest and sent to the border. And so I use Spanish every day here. Most of our ministry, even on the US side, at our parish, most of our ministry is in Spanish. Brownsville is a very bilingual city. Most people are bilingual, but when it comes to their experience of their faith and the way they celebrate sacraments like Mass and reconciliation, they often just default and prefer Spanish. And so we see a lot of that. My fellow Jesuit who's down here, Louis Hotap, his story is a little bit different. When he got the phone call, we both were ordained together in June of last year, and our provincial is the one who kind of called us up and pitched this idea of sending us to the border. And so when he called me, I mean, I'd lived in Nicaragua. I'd gotten very interested in immigration. I'd spent a summer working in Nogales, Arizona, and Sonora with the Kino Border Project, which is run by participated by Jesuits. And so I was super fired up, and I said yes right away. And then he said, "Oh, I'm also thinking about sending Louis. What do you think?" I was like, "Well, you might want to talk to him, because Louis has spent his entire adult life preparing to go to Russia. He studied Russian language, he studied Russian culture, Russian liturgy, and all that. And so for him to come down here and serve in Spanish has been a little bit more of a hurdle, but he's worked at it very hard. And then he spent a couple months this summer, or he spent 6 weeks this summer, 5 weeks this summer, doing language lessons with a tutor in Mexico City with a team of tutors. And so he's done very well at it, but it can be a bit of an obstacle. It's definitely helpful to speak Spanish. But if you come down here with a group, there are great ways to have encounters down here. And right now, I should add, I've got other questions I'll get to in a second. I should add that now I'm doing Duolingo for Haitian Creole, because with so many Haitians down here, many of them have lived in Chile or the Dominican Republic and speak some Spanish. Others are coming from Brazil, so they speak Haitian Creole, they speak French, they speak Portuguese, but not English and Spanish. And so we can't find a common ground language. But I'm trying to learn even just some basic phrases in Creole. I'll take some other questions. Carolyn in New York City asked, what advice would you give to someone just starting in the work at the border? I would say, if you're working on the border, be open to learning, because there's a lot to learn, and don't assume you're an expert at anything. Assume someone else knows more than you, because that's the approach we've had to take. And that's certainly revealed itself in many ways. Every time I thought I'm starting to get to know something, I figure out how little I actually know. So a humble approach, I think, is the best way to kind of approach border ministry. And then I think it's also very important to approach migrants as human beings, right? Let them share their stories. It can be very tempting down here to start to group them in categories or to think of them in statistics and numbers. But that's, I think, a temptation we want to try to avoid. We want to honor the dignity of each person and think of migrants as individual people that carry their own struggles and joys, and also their own stories. Patricia's asking, other than Title 42 being revoked, what would be your recommendations for effective and meaningful change? Oh man, we don't have time for me to lay out all of my recommendations, but I think our immigration system at large is in dire need of reform. And so, for example, you have a lot of people who are coming to the country primarily motivated by economic reasons. But if you're a poor Central American farmer, there's no legal way for you to enter the country if you just want to come and look for a job, which seems really contradictory when I drive around so many cities in the US and see all these now hiring signs. I'm like, gosh, I know a great labor force of people who would be wonderful employees to work here. We just don't let them into our country. So there's not a lot of avenues for economic migrants to legally enter the country. I hear the language of get in line and, enter legally. I mean, there's a backlog for even legal immigration that is literally years and decades long. And so that's why you get a lot of people who come to the border and they're seeking asylum, and there's not a lot of avenue, and that's maybe one of the only avenues they have to kind of legally enter the country. And so I think we need to also reform immigration policy in the country. We have a lot of even undocumented people who are in the country, and I think we need to treat them as human persons and find a dignified way for those who spent a long time in the country. So people who were entered under TPS, temporary protective strategy, temporary protective status, many have fled a decade or more, 2 decades ago, situations of civil war or natural disasters, and were given temporary status. Well, now they've lived here 20 years and they've had jobs and they own houses, they've paid taxes, they've got kids who are now grown up or kids who are in schools here. And so the threat of that being revoked, as our previous president threatened to revoke, means that their lives are very unstable. So there's a lot of ways that we could reform immigration law and policy. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind. So going on to another question from Patricia. I know we've hit the hour, so I'll just before I take some more questions, I'll just take a pause to say thank you to everyone for joining in on this call. I want to be sensitive to your time, so if it's a good time for you now to leave and sign off, I want to thank you for that. Mary Beth, I don't know if you want to say anything briefly before I take on more questions, just to give people a kind of a close to it if they want to leave and have to leave now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's a great way to start off our year of events, and please stay tuned. We are starting in-person events in Boston. So in October 6th is our next event, and we have an event coming online in October on art and spirituality. So I think we have a good program lineup. So I hope to see you all again. And please feel free to sign off now or stay with Brian and I, and we can talk a little bit more.
Okay, great. I'll continue for now. I've still got a little bit more time in my evening, so happy to take on some more questions here. So Patricia asked, who and how are we going to make the reform? This has been decades of dysfunction, correct? How do we make something happen now? Is it really political? Is it ignorance? If I had an easy question, an easy answer to that, I'd be sharing it everywhere, dramatically. But the truth is, we're in such a political deadlock that it's hard to get any meaningful legislation passed through Congress, for example, right now at all. I mean, right now, what we're seeing happening at the border, as we're seeing with basically all policies, is that Congress is at a deadlock and isn't passing a lot of legislation. And so presidents, and this started predominantly with Obama and then with Trump and now with Biden, they issue executive orders that then take effect, and then courts either sue them and say that they can't put it into effect, or courts allow them to keep it. And then there might be a change in government, and then the new president might revoke it. And then courts will decide whether it can actually be revoked or not. And so that's basically the way the country is mostly governed policy-wise now, is through executive orders that then get ruled in the courts. So we saw that with the migrant protection protocols or Remain in Mexico, and we see that right now still playing out with Title 42. So, I mean, we could use some change in Congress to where they're able to pass legislation. I think that would be the most meaningful. We need some actual immigration reform to pass through Congress, so we can advocate to our Congress representatives in the Senate and in the House. But it is a huge uphill battle. I mean, we are fighting very much against the stream, because at the end of the day, what's the motive of a political party, whether it's a Democrat or Republican? Their motive is to win elections, and that means to win more votes. And it might help you get some votes speaking about the importance of migrants in some way, or the reverse. It might help you. You might think it helps you get votes to say we need to build a stronger wall, we need better border security, we have an open border, we need to close out our country to migrants. That's basically just the lip service of migration. It's either you say we need a more humanitarian response to migrants, or we need to close up our border more. So that's some of the language that's used to help win elections. But at the end of the day, migrants aren't a voting population, so you don't have to push for a lot of policy for immigration reform. So until we get a groundswell of people concerned, of American voting citizens, frankly, concerned about the plight of migrants and the humanitarian need there, and start speaking out to our politicians and representatives and saying, why are we not paying more attention to this? this is affecting my community. Immigration is not a border issue. It's here in our community, and I'm seeing the effects of it because there are people here who are living under temporary protective status or who are in the DACA program that's being threatened to be revoked. That's an example of an executive order that, has been threatened and isn't actually legislative policy passed through Congress. And so they're living in my community, or they've been paroled into the country and exempted from Title 42, but they can't get enrolled in the asylum process. And I'm concerned they're my neighbors and friends and people that I've worked with. We need to reform our system. So until we see some huge groundswell of support, I'm afraid legislation change might not come. And so in the meantime, what can we do? Well, we got to keep doing that and spreading the word and sharing the story and then getting involved. And that starts to affect us and affect the people that we invite into that ministry. So I invite and encourage all of you to use whatever platforms you have to kind of do that. I'll take another question here. From Adrian, who said, I often have a hard time talking to some conservatives who claim to be Christian but are anti-immigration. I try to reference the Bible, bring up how Jesus would probably treat these migrants, but don't get very far. The blatant hypocrisy is very frustrating to me. You must have encountered some of these folks in Texas. Any tips? I would say, yeah, I encounter people on both sides of the political spectrum, honestly, who I think have a lot of misinformation about migrants and their situation, and who maybe don't take a particularly Christian response to it. And often, I think that's often rooted in false impressions and false understandings and misconceptions. And so the first thing I would always invite someone into is to have a personal encounter, to meet a migrant, to get to know a migrant story. That's the way to really convert hearts. And so if someone's talking to me about this, and saying, oh, okay, let me just create like a scenario. If someone comes and talks to me and is saying like, I'm just really upset about what's happening at our border. It's just an open border and anyone can kind of get in. And it's just all these people who are coming and to look and to steal our jobs. And that's what they're doing. And, they might have a criminal background and they're just trying to sneak through the cracks. And that's what's happening. Well, that to me is laced with a lot of misinformation. So my response might be like, wow, that doesn't really reflect my experience at the border. I see a lot of people who don't have any line that they can get into because as migrants, because especially with Title 42 right now, even as asylum seekers, there's no legal way for them to enter the country. So they're left in a very dire situation. And a lot of them can contribute very positively to our economy, which is something that is for the good of all of us in the country. Let me share a couple of stories of people who I've met who have had some very difficult journeys and are looking for a better life here. And then I might share a story or two and hope that can kind of change and re-divert a little bit of the conversation about it. So trying to correct some information, maybe, but at the end of the day, sharing stories or inviting people to a personal encounter, I think is what actually kind of converts hearts. So that'd be my invitation to anyone about understanding what's going on at the border. Another question here from Patricia: who is working on this legislation? Who is the most interested in this issue on the legislative side? That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that. I'd probably refer you to JRS, Jesuit Refugee Services, and Jillian McPherson. She'd probably be the best resource to reach out to. You can probably Google search Jesuit Refugee Services online and look for her there and ask her. She'd probably have some good, some even better information on that. Adam, who's from Denver, mentions Jason Crow as one person maybe who's been working positively for immigration legislation. Great. Practical issues, address to be truly compassionate human response. Yeah. Well, great. I think we've gotten to a good spot in terms of responding to all of these. And so Carolyn, do you have a question for me? Go ahead.
I do, yeah. We've got a Fordham connection. I'm actually studying for a DMin there.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah. I also spent 20 years working on a psych unit as an art therapist. And Westchester, where I live, is a weird community. It's got some very wealthy enclaves, the Clintons and all that. But there's also a large undocumented community, a lot from Guatemala. And in the hospital where I worked, at times on our little psych unit, it's a wonderful little 15-bed place, we would get people, there'd be alcohol issues, people with such frustration because they can't find jobs. They're living in crazy, horrible conditions, flooded basements, that's where they're living. And so there's some suicidality not just with the older people, but with the younger as well. So I found that in my art room, at times people would come in, and even if I can't speak much Spanish at all, it doesn't matter because they've got stuff to work with, to play with. There's that spark of creativity that everybody has. And when you've gone through so much trauma, you need to relearn how to relax and how to play. So I'm wondering, what services have you got, down where you are for not just the kids, but for anyone to like give some kind of emotional release to all of the trauma and the confusion and just the sheer guts that they have to continue forward. What's being done there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I mean, I think it is really important for kids and adults to find ways to play, to use a word, just to have some sense of escape and enjoyment in life. And also that can often, help you to process some of your experience. And so I'm happy to report that part of what we do is sacramental ministry. And I think that is also really helpful and healthy for people. It's not uncommon to see someone come forward to receive the Eucharist or a blessing from us during communion, and just to be weeping. And so I think it's just it could be a very tender moment for someone. So that pastoral accompaniment, I think, meets some of the needs that you're speaking to. But play, I think, is also important. So sometimes we'll bring over like crayons and coloring books and color with kids there. We've got a bunch of sisters from different congregations, IHM sisters, Franciscan sisters, and Mercy sisters, who often accompany us into northern Mexico. And just last Thursday, we got a bunch of Haitian women to join us for Zumba. And so Sister Patricia, who's like in her mid 60s, was leading Zumba, and Father Louis and I are there trying to mimic some of the, join in with Zumba. And I think everyone was laughing, on the floor laughing about it, but also some kind of physical exercise and relief. Yeah. And then at the same time, a couple of the other sisters were doing some coloring activities with the kids. Save the Children, Sidewalk School are a couple education-oriented institutions that run programming and education, but also games and that sort of thing for children. So there are a few outlets for it, but that is a tremendous need too. So we try to incorporate some of that. I played a lot of Duck Duck Goose and a lot of Heads Up 7 Up with kids in Casa del Migrante over the summer. So those are some ways that we try to plug into to that sense of play, especially with children. But those Zumba lessons was a big hit. That was the first time Sister Patricia tried that. And I think she's coming back on Thursday, and I think we're going to try it again. So I think that's a great way for people to kind of get up and get a little active, and also be able to laugh at themselves and one another, and maybe laugh at me and Father Louis too.
I find also drumming circles and any kind of percussive stuff that's
great.
It goes beyond language, and it is visceral, and it comes from the body.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, I could also mention that the Sidewalk School, one of these education institutions, it ran a project in some of the shelters where it had kids draw when the people were living in the plaza, in this plaza in Reynosa, to draw what their home was like there. And it was really stunning to see some of what they drew that included like, oh, here are like, it's like, what are these? Oh, it's a bunch of rats around the tent that you drew where you live. And like, what is this knife here? It's like, oh yeah, I don't feel safe. And so it was very revelatory to the experience of what these kids were using. So art can be a powerful way for people to speak and process, and even to reveal to you some of the realities. And then they'd often draw like maybe like a river and this giant like barbed wire fence, and then this like blue sky sun. And it's like, this is the United States. It's this place of hope and opportunity, but this is these barriers that aren't allowing us to get there. And so it can be very revelatory. Art can be very revelatory. So that's another way that I saw that kind of being put into use. So thank you for sharing for your ministry and experience, and glad I was able to share on that. So I think with that, we're out of time. But again, I want to thank Mary Beth and Jesuit Connections for this invitation. It was a great privilege for me to share with all of you. And thank you for sticking on for a little bit of extra time for us to share. This was really a great privilege for me, and I hope some of you reach out and can stay connected to these issues and stay involved.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again soon.
All right. God bless. Take care, everyone.